Hello everyone, thanks a lot for having me. So this paper is sort of very, very different from what Enrico presented. Enrico's work is more sort of broad sweep of history. This is more the type of sort of very narrow, concentrated beam of light on a very specific question type paper. So you're not going to learn anything about global economic development over the last 500 years or anything like that. The sort of motivating impetus for this paper was that there is a very large literature, and Enrico has worked on that literature, on the effects of heterogeneity on economic development, linguistic heterogeneity, religious heterogeneity, ethnic heterogeneity. And there's this sort of rising sense in the literature, especially in the African context, but also in other contexts, that when you're sort of shoehorning people of different ethnicity, of different religious affiliation into the same polities, and you make them govern themselves together, you're not just shoehorning people together who are different, you're also shoehorning people together who just have no history of shared governance. So it's not just that they're different, it's also that they never cooperated or governed themselves jointly in the past, and now you're making them do that. And so Native American reservations, what is sort of from a research or empirical perspective nice about Native American reservations, is that there is no ethnic heterogeneity, there is no linguistic heterogeneity on reservations, but there's plenty of heterogeneity in the sense of different, what you're going to see being labeled as bands, different sub-tribal groups who had no history of shared governance being shoehorned together into what we now call reservations, so into polities where they govern themselves jointly. So the idea is that you can control for the whole ethnic, linguistic, religious aspect is just simply not there, and you focus only on the fact that these are people that had no history of shared governance before they were thrown together into reservations. And so the nutshell of the paper, I guess, so if you're going to take only three things away, those are the three things you should take away. The first is that when reservations were formed, which is on average about 140 years ago, there's quite a bit of variation in that, but on average 140 years ago, a lot of reservations integrated different sub-tribal bands, but not all of them did. And so this integration of sub-tribal bands, which I'm going to call forced coexistence, this matters greatly today. So reservations on which separate sub-tribal bands had been integrated onto a shared reservation are about 30% poorer today than otherwise identical reservations. The second thing that I think is very interesting is that while the shock occurred 140 years ago, the data actually says, at least on the economic outcome front, it didn't matter until the 1990s. And the story here is that this is really a story of persistent social divisions. But until the federal government, so the US government, actually ceded substantial decision-making power to the reservation, which happened in the late 80s, early 90s, it just didn't transmit into economic outcomes. So people may have been unhappy in a loose sense. There may have been a lot of political conflict on these reservations even before, but it just didn't transmit into anything measurable on the per capita income front. And so the real divergence only happens in the late 1990s and in the 2000 data. And then thirdly, from an empirical point of view, I will argue that the findings that I will show you are causal in the sense that I actually have a plausibly exogenous source of variation in how individual reservations were formed based on historical mining rushes, which changed the value of the lands that different bands occupied and changed the incentives of the US government in forming reservations, as you're going to see. So the motivating, or a second motivating fact, maybe more like a specifically Native American motivating fact, is that there's just a huge amount. So we all know, or many of us know, that Native Americans are very, very poor within the US context. They're the poorest ethnic group. But there's actually a huge amount of variation in that. So the coefficient of variation, so the variation relative to the mean, is about 60%, which is, considering it's within a country, that's actually very, very big. So just for comparison, the coefficient of variation across US states is just 12%. And we know that California is significantly richer than Alabama, but that variation is only about 12%. So there's a lot more variation across Native American reservations. And when you read about what's going on reservations, there's this overwhelming impression that it's got to do with local politics. So local political conflict on the reservation between different groups. And there's this sort of anthropological or sort of sociological, if you like, literature, sort of very case study based literature where researchers have gone into the field, conducted surveys, etc. And what falls out of that literature is that these political divisions today, so there's no parties on reservations, there's nothing like parties, but they're groups, they're interest groups that are competing, and that these groups are formed in historical bands. And bands are essentially sub-tribal units that we think of as having made up a tribe in historical times. And so I'm going to give you sort of a stylized, very stylized vision of what a tribe is and what a band is. And that is a very, very stylized version of it, but that's the stylized version I'm going to be using in my empirics. What I'm going to be doing is what I did do is I look at all the reservations in the US today, and I figure out, was a reservation formed at the band level or was it formed out of a number of bands? And it's simply just a binary distinction. That's just an issue of measurement precision. So for some instances, I know exactly it's these 5 bands that formed the reservation. In other instances, I only know it's a number of bands. I know for sure it's a number of bands. I don't know how many. So I can't calculate an index, and I wouldn't have any population weights either. So it's a very coarse distinction. It's either formed at the band level or formed out of multiple bands, however, always of the same tribe. So there's never any heterogeneity across tribes within a reservation. Then I have a lot of measures of how tribes were organized in historical times. And so the mappings from reservations to tribes is essentially a many-to-one mapping. So many of the larger tribes have multiple reservations. The Sioux have 12 reservations, the Chippewa have 11 reservations, the Apache have 4. And then there's a number of smaller tribes that only have 1 reservation. But there's never, every reservation is always uniquely mapped to a tribe, which from an empirical point of view is sort of nice because you can use within tribe cross-reservation variation, which sort of allows you, without being completely, if you're not completely sure that you're going to be able to control for everything that matters in the history of a tribe fixed effect will just sort of wash that out. You might not exactly know what it means, but from an empirical point of view, it will just get rid of it. Whatever it means, it will be sort of killed off in the empirics. And so from that point of view, it's sort of nice. And there's this data, which I'm sure this data source is going to come up again in the next day and a half, because we all love using it. The Ethnographic Atlas is basically sort of a meta study by an anthropologist of a large number of anthropological studies of ethnic groups in historical times. How were they organized, how politically integrated were they, and then lots of stuff on like gender, sedentariness, did you have a roof over your head, types of agriculture, lots of stuff that probably isn't very essential for me, but might come up in some other papers you're going to see. And so in this extremely stylized, there is a more sophisticated version of this, but I'm not going to give that to you today. In this extremely stylized way, there's 2 types of tribes. So there's this type of tribe up here and this type of tribe up here. And tribes consist of these sub-tribal bands. And there are tribes in which each band is a separate autonomous political unit. And this is data that falls out of the Ethnographic Atlas. So here, the tribe is really just a notion. In some of the qualitative literature, it's sort of described as it's just non-hostility. So just like a mutual understanding, if bands of the same tribe run into each other, at least you're not going to bash each other's head in. You might engage in some trade, but it's mostly just a limitation on hostility. Whereas in the lower case, so an example of this would be, for instance, the Iroquois or the Cherokee. These are tribes that are genuinely politically integrated in the sense that bands are subunits of a broader political entity. And so this is data that basically falls out of the Ethnographic Atlas. And then the data that I sort of superimpose on that, if you like, is I just look at what is a reservation today. And so a reservation today is one of these boxes, and I ask, is a reservation made up of 1 band or is it made up of multiple bands? Now the argument that I initially wanted to make, because it's the argument that sort of is being made or has been made by qualitative researchers, is I wanted to say that being integrated into a shared polity is bad if you had no history of shared governance. So I wanted to say it's bad to be here, but it's only bad to be up here, not down here, because down here you have a history of shared governance, and therefore that prepared you for running yourselves jointly. As an empirical matter, I am unable to do that, as you're going to see, because this data cell here is almost empty, which means the only statement that I can make conclusively is I can show you it's bad to be up here and it's bad to be over there. In other words, being in the top right is the sum of two effects. It's the sum of having a shared reservation and having had no history of joint governance, but I cannot make the explicit statement that the history of joint governance is good because it mitigates the negative effects of being put together. That's the bit that I personally believe. It is what falls out of the qualitative literature, but the data doesn't actually quite allow me to pin that down. And so here is an example of that. This is one of the more prominent tribes that many of us know about. This is the Apache. And the Apache consists of these is it seven? It's 8. Of these 8 bands. And of these 8 bands, most of them were put on 2 reservations where many of them were put. So the Mescalero Reservation and the San Carlos Reservation, they're coded as suffering from, if you like, forced coexistence. So they are made up of multiple bands. And it was only the Jicarilla that obtained their own band level reservation. And so in this example, there'd be within tribal variation across reservations in forced coexistence. What's sort of nice is that the qualitative literature in many ways is sort of very consistent with this story. So the ethnographic atlas, for instance, speaks very clearly on the Apache indeed being not historically integrated. So the Apache are indeed just this agglomeration of separate bands where the main difference between an Apache band running into another Apache band or an Apache band running into a Hopi band is that if you run randomly in a Hopi band, you're most likely going to engage in some kind of violent conflict, or at least there'll be a danger of hostility. Whereas if you run into another Apache band, you might trade a little bit and then you go your separate ways. So that's kind of the idea. And then there are also these sort of case studies on reservations that sort of speak very clearly on, well, you look at these reservations, you look at what's going on there, and you just have a bunch of disparate people that are just consisting of these heterogeneous communities that don't really know how to interact or that don't really want to interact. And so this is the data. And so this was the problem that I mentioned earlier, is this data cell is the number of reservations that came from larger politically centralized tribes, but were formed at the band level. And so because there's only 3 of them, you're just simply not getting enough traction to really distinguish this top right cell, both from the bottom right and the top left. So you just can't do that econometrically. What you can do is you can look at the effect of historical centralization. So this is a tribe level characteristic. And you can look at the effect of being bunched together as multiple bands in a reservation. And that's this forced coexistence characteristic. And what you see quite clearly, this is income per capita, what you see quite clearly is that the top right does stand out in terms of being significantly lower. So per capita income in log terms here is about 30% lower than per capita income in the other 3 cells. It's just that you do not know whether that's just the sum of 2 effects or a more complicated interaction of the 2. That's something that I cannot pin down. This is a map of reservations in the US today. One thing that's sort of noticeable is that there's sort of like a pretty barren area here. That has a lot to do with changes towards Native American policy and Indian removal after 1830. So eastern tribes got removed to Oklahoma, and then they stayed in Oklahoma, but there's no reservations in Oklahoma today. So a lot of the eastern Native Americans ended up here with no reservations, which means that to some extent my story is primarily, the story of reservations today is primarily a story of Native American tribes west of the Mississippi. Native American tribes who originated east of the Mississippi just primarily do not live on reservations today. They live in things that are called tribal statistical areas, which just simply means it's an area with a lot of Native Americans in it, but it's not a reservation, it's not a polity. And it's really polities that I'm interested in. Another thing that you notice is that there's a fair amount of spatial clustering even west of the Mississippi, so there's just a lot of Sioux reservations here, a lot of Chippewa reservations here, a lot of northwestern fishing tribes here. And so that just tells you that sort of controlling for spatial characteristics, controlling for where you are, controlling for proximity to cities, perhaps market access, things like that, could be potentially important, and they are. This is just a balancing table. It's a little bit unusual in that you see this is sort of the mean difference between forced coexistence, not forced coexistence, t-statistic r squared, so you can really just focus on this number, I guess. There is a very, very significant correlation between forced coexistence and historical centralization. And that's why it's very, very important to control for historical centralization. And the idea is simply that, well, tribes that were historically centralized, they were just more likely to negotiate with the government jointly. So when you look at these original treaties and signatory bands, it's just very clear that tribes that were politically centralized, like the Cherokee, they signed these treaties together. And so they were just much more likely to end up with a shared reservation. And so you've got this relatively strong positive correlation between a negative force, if you like, which is forced coexistence, and a positive force, which is having, or at least we think maybe positive force, which is to have been more centralized politically in the past. And so it's just very, very important to control for that. Another thing, on every other respect, these look sort of very balanced, which from an empirical point of view just simply means that you have a good shot at maybe identifying something causal. It's not all you need, but it's sort of a good starting point. One thing that sort of stands out is that demographics today are quite different. Now, those are in large part an outcome. At some level, it's natural that a place that was formed out of multiple bands would be larger today than a place that was formed out of just one band, to the extent that more bands are bigger than one band. There isn't much I can do about that in the paper, except extensively controlling for any possible scale effects. There's also this very interesting demographic effect here, where the poorer reservations just have much, much younger demographics. Now I think that might be because they're culturally more removed from the French. I'm not sure, but when you read the story, the most likely explanation for that seems to be that in the very poor places, welfare payments are just very, very important. And having more kids is actually, oftentimes having more kids is actually a significant part of your income as a household. And so that seems to be at least part of the story. There isn't a lot I can do about that. I think of that as another outcome that isn't really my focus in the paper. It's certainly something I control for, but I may not even need to control for in the sense that it's an outcome, not something that was there exogenously. This is really the main table of the paper, where I incrementally add additional controls. The main gist of it is that when I include just the two main variables of interest, then having been forcibly integrated, so having a bunch of bands thrown together on a reservation, lowers incomes on that reservation by about 40% today. However, having been historically more centralized, which does correlate very significantly with that, but works in the opposite direction, raises incomes by about 30% today. And then you simply add reservation level controls, tribe level controls, more reservation controls. I'm not going to get into what the difference here is. And then state fixed effects are sort of important because you can tell there's a lot of spatial clustering here. And so you're just sort of worried about maybe it's all just a story of like the Apache living down south where it's just a poor economic environment versus tribes in California, say. And then you're over here. And so basically everything sort of holds up. And it holds up in a sort of meaningful way in the sense that as you're tracing the R squared across columns, the R squared actually keeps going up. So in other words, you're not just saying my measure of interest is robust to introducing a bunch of junk. It's actually robust to introducing meaningful stuff. And it remains there. The main finding sort of remains there. And then down here, you're introducing tribe fixed effects. So tribe fixed effects, there you just take the stance. I'm just not completely confident that the ethnographic atlas is going to measure everything that I care about, that I can control for everything that might matter for long-run development. So I'm just going to wash out an average Apache effect. I'm going to wash out an average Sioux effect on top of a state fixed effect. So at this point, you have a bunch of fixed effects washing out a lot of the variation, but you still get, so this is sort of the most conservative, if you like, estimate of what forced coexistence does to you. And so at that point, that's sort of all you can do with just looking at the data. So that's sort of all you can do without coming up with an IV strategy or some other sort of more sophisticated empirical strategy. And so the main worry here is you're controlling for a bunch of stuff, but the main worry here is just endogenous reservation formation. And so, for example, one of the 3 reservations that was formed out of a larger political structure, what was formed at the band level, is the Tonawanda band of the Iroquois. And when you read their founding myth, which you really need to sort of read as a founding myth, because it's basically people today making up a story about themselves 200 years ago, and so you really got to take it with multiple grains of salt. But they talk very much about how they had this unique coherence as a group 300 years ago, and so they made sure that they negotiated separately with the US government in forming their reservation, and they're doing very well today because they're this incredibly coherent political unit. And so that's the worry. That's what you're worried about, that there's endogenous reservation formation. And so the idea in this paper is to look at exogenous sources of variation in the value of the land that bands occupied, which changed the incentives of the government to form bigger, more centralized reservations. And the idea is basically when you're rounding up more bands, it's more easy to monitor these bands and prevent them from spilling back onto their ancestral territories, which you care more about when the ancestral territories are more valuable to you. So that's the basic story. And one way in which that is sort of borne out in the historical record is that most military conflict between Native Americans and the US government west of the Mississippi was actually not about putting people on reservations, but preventing tribes from spilling back on their ancestral territories. So tribes migrating out of their reservations to return to where they came from. And so with a lot of these historical IV papers, so you have an instrument, and typically what's the case is that there's not a lot of disagreement on the instrument being exogenous at the time. So people are usually fine with, here's something that was basically random 200 years ago, okay. Most of the debate is about, did this thing that was basically random, like a historical mining rush, did it really only work through forced integration? So did it only affect economic circumstance 200 years down the road through the fact that you've bunched up or shoehorned a bunch of people into a shared polity? And so that's really what most of the, the 80-20 effect. You spend a lot of time crossing T's and dotting I's, and that's all about this down here. That's probably not super, super interesting to you. So I'm going to show you more the basic gist of the idea. So this is a coarse but basic map of Native American tribes before reservations were found. And then you supplement one issue with maps. This is, I don't know, a little bit of a nerdy excursion, I guess. One issue with maps is when you have multiple smaller but finer maps, their projections vary, and it becomes incredibly difficult to actually geo-rectify them all into a shared data set. So it's much easier to start with one big thing and then sort of locally supplement it with finer sliced data to the extent that you can. And that's basically what you do, and that's your map of Native American bands and tribes in pre-reservation times. And then you have this map of mining activity. It actually doesn't come out very well, but there are these mining clusters behind these state-level shadings, and these mining clusters are associated with values. And these mining clusters, we have these maps for 1860, 1870, 1880, which is basically the core period of reservation formation. And so then what you do is you associate each reservation with an area that you call its ancestral homeland. That's where the people used to live who are now on that reservation. You overlay that with historical mining rushes, and you get your instrument. So you get a measure of, did these people exogenously live in an area where land was more valuable, just driven by mining rushes? Doesn't matter. What you always do with these IV exercises is you show what's called a first stage and a reduced form. The first stage just basically asks, the story you're telling me about exogenous mining rushes mattering, is that true? Do they matter? And so that's the top panel here, just saying that these two measures of historical mining, gold and silver mining, they impacted forest coexistence very significantly. So they did lead to more aggregated reservations. And then you ask, well, if there's this exogenous shock that leads to something like forest coexistence, but let's say I ignore that part, if it leads to something that is negative, it should have a direct negative effect if I ignore the forced coexistence part. And that's what you do in what's called a, I don't know if this is interesting to you guys. Okay, I'll just keep going. We'll figure it out afterwards. That's what's called the reduced form. And so what you want to see here is a negative effect of these mining rushes on long-run development, and then your sort of empirical stance is that that negative effect works only through having agglomerated people into what's called forced coexistence. And then you get these IV estimates, which are basically just they're similar to the OLS estimates before, it's just that you have more confidence in them because the variation you're using for identification is just entirely driven by these exogenous mining rushes. And so basically the gist of it is that you're getting coefficients that are, statistically speaking, identical. So in other words, the effect that you found in the previous exercises seems to be actually a causal effect. Okay? So at this point, you've kind of established that the basic story seems to be true, but you don't know a lot yet about why is it that shoehorning these people into shared polities is bad for long-run development. So now there's sort of a big mechanism section. And so the basic idea with the mechanism section is that there is a lot of qualitative evidence to fall back onto. And so what the qualitative evidence suggests is, one, the political structures of reservations, the way that reservations were formed, there's an incredible amount of discretionary power in the hands of elected politicians because there's no real checks and balances between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. So for instance, there is no independent judiciary, but almost all important cases of legal conflict on a reservation, so say an outside mining company comes in to lease a mine, when there's a legal conflict, it gets arbitrated on the reservation court. Now the judge on the reservation court can be hired and fired by the tribal council chairman, and if the legal court case is between a mining company and the cousin of the tribal chairman, then you've got a problem. And so that's exactly the kind of legal hold-up story that you keep reading about. Okay? And one way in which you can get at this, one way in which you can try to sort of find some evidence for that, is to use time variation based on the idea that while these internal organizational structures were set in 1934, they really didn't have any bite until the early 1990s. They didn't have any bite in the sense that tribes themselves were actually not allowed to arbitrate these things. So everything was basically just run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And then there was a lot of cession of power to the tribes themselves in the early 90s, late 1980s. And so you would expect a divergence to occur then. And there's actually plenty of anecdotal evidence that sort of pointed me in that direction. And so the bottom line of this divergence table here is that we have data for Native American tribes or reservations from 1960 to 2000. So we just have nothing before 1960. And then you run everything with fixed effect. So you're washing out for each reservation the average, just goes into what's called a fixed effect. So you don't observe that in the table here. And then you ask, is there something different in 1980 relative to the average? Is there something different in 1990 relative to the average? Is there something different in 2000 relative to the average? And you find that only in 2000 is there this big effect of forced coexistence relative to some average effect that is buried in this regression that's sort of there all the time. So in other words, if you look at this 20% reduction in income, you compare it to your cross-sectional results for 2000 of about a 30% reduction in income, that's loosely like saying like 2/3 of your total effect in 2000 is driven by divergence from 1990 to 2000. And so that's a sort of very powerful and interesting fact because it's telling you something. Here's this like latent historical characteristic that's been there the whole time but didn't really transmit into anything that we could measure until the 1990s. So you can think of this like, one analogy might be when there's like Yugoslavia breaking up. Like until the 1990s, there wasn't really anything measurable that told us there was something wrong in Yugoslavia, but then something else changes and things really go sideways. And one thing that's really interesting is when you look at, so all the controls are in all these regressions for every decade. So you're allowing every control to have a different effect in every decade. And then you can ask, do all these other controls like economic environment, et cetera, do they matter differentially over time? And what you find is that all of the controls, so p-values, I'm not sure how familiar you are with these, but basically lower means more important. And what you find is that everything matters more in 2000. So in other words, not just this story, but across the board, anything that could matter for economic development starts to only really matter in 2000. And that's just because up to then, everything is just run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So it's kind of like you're keeping a lid on any kind of divergence because everything is just sort of washed out by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. One other thing you can do to actually get at, well, is there this political mechanism in the background, is you can try to measure conflict. Obviously, there's no actual sort of objectively measured data on conflict directly on reservations. So what you do, the sort of fallback that other people have used as well, is you look at newspaper articles. So there's digitized databases of newspapers, and then you can just do search queries for keywords. And then you count the number of hits. And you're basically saying, for this reservation in this decade, in my case, I find so and so many articles that had certain keywords in them that I think proxy for something. And so the slicing of the data that I chose is that I sliced the data into reports of conflict and government, or conflict and not government, and corruption and government, or corruption and not government. The top and bottom panel are just basically different econometric specifications. There's nothing substantive in that distinction. And then column 1 versus 2, 3 versus 4, 5 versus 6, etc. That's just slicing the data into a time dimension in addition. So in other words, what column 1 tells you, and maybe I'll stick down here because it's easier, what column 1 tells you is that on the reservations with forced integration, they had about a 13% bigger share of newspaper counts that pertained to conflicts specifically involving the reservation government. So government here means reservation government, so keywords proxying for the reservation government. There's a little bit of an effect, you can see the significance levels here are sort of close to significant, about conflict not involving the government too, but really the money is in columns 1 and 2. And then the other thing that you see is that you again get this time divergence. So in the 1990s, there isn't much of an effect. There is a bit of an effect, but it's not very pronounced. And then into the 2000s actually means 1990 to 2000. I should be precise. The newspaper data starts in 1980. In that decade from 1990 to 2000 is when you really get this pronounced sort of heating up, if you like, of political conflict coinciding with the divergence of economic income. Okay? Sort of try to cut this down. Yeah, I'll actually ignore this. And I'm done, so I can give my little policy tilt.
Okay,
yes, as you requested. So the message, I guess the problem with these types of papers where history matters is always that you can be accused of sort of historical determinism. It's sort of like, yeah, this thing happened 200 years ago and now you're screwed and that's just it. But I think when you actually, what's sort of really interesting is when you talk to policymakers in the field, in the Native American field, which I actually do a fair bit. So for example, at UCLA Anderson, we're actually now developing an MBA consulting program where MBAs can go pro bono and advise reservations. And so there's just a lot of sort of impetus for institutional reform. And what's really interesting is that you get the impression that the reservations that are run poorly, the reservations that are not doing well, they know this now. So it's sort of more like, well, the divergence had to happen for people to actually be able to observe that there's a tangible difference between a reservation that's run well and a reservation that's not run well. Now that you see that, there's actually a lot of institutional impetus, in particular by the places that are run poorly or that are not doing so well up to now, to improve on things. And one of the institutional innovations that you see the most is independent tribal courts, because tribal courts just seem to be incredibly important for the business environment on a reservation, because that's where all the legal disputes are arbitrated. Yeah. Done.
Thank you, Christian. So we'll take 5 minutes or so for Q&A with the audience, and as before, I'll be happy to encourage students to go first. But if you're feeling shy, Anand already has his hand raised, so we'll put Anand's pretend student hat on, and we'll let Anand encourage the rest to go. Oh, we have a question from a student.
Thank you for your presentation. I just want to know a bit more on how governance was held inside the reservation, like how they do to manage to elect their leader or to run, because you're putting together very different people, different background, cultural, so how do they interact, and so what was the model?
They didn't have a government until 1934. So until 1934, everything is run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Then in 1934, there's this act that's been called the Indian New Deal. It's sort of in the wake of FDR's New Deal legislation. Basically, I'm going to give you a bit more history than you asked for. Basically, a lot of Native Americans fought in World War I. And so that leads to a sort of, that gives them a bit more political clout. So there's more people saying, well, we should sort of give citizenship to Native Americans and they should be able to run their own affairs. And so in 1934, you have this thing called the Indian New Deal, or the Indian Reorganization Act, which basically sort of imposes an institutional template on them. And so everyone gets a government at that point. It's just that the government doesn't get to say a lot. And so these constitutions, you can look them up. So there's like an online database that has the constitution in it. But there's very little variation in that constitution.
Second,
yes,
okay, second question. When you start the presentation, you were making an allusion to some African countries in terms of forced coexistence, which in some way look similar to what's happening to the reservation. So my question is, how, if ever you think about, how can you, is it possible to infer the results from this study to another level, like countries, African countries, for example?
Yeah.
Because I know from the colonization, the country we inherited were formed on that basis. And specifically, my country is an association of very different groups of people in terms of ethnicity. And these are later consequences on the whole political system after. Because when you go to democracy, basically what's happened, political parties are just built on ethnicities and group. So this coexistence, because in the case of countries, there is no super institution to rule them. Like when conflict happens in reservation, we have super institution at the federal level to deal with. So do you think about how?
Yeah, so the referees really pushed me on that point, and I just didn't really end up being able to give a very good answer. I think the thing is that what we see in the African data, people just kind of focus on Africa when it comes to linguistic, ethno-linguistic fractionalization. What we know in the data is that there's an almost mechanical relationship between fractionalization and this variable that I call historical centralization. And that's because if you take like a country today, and you find that it's more fractionalized, part of that is because there were smaller ethnic groups. So you end up with more fractionalization, but just because all the ethnic groups in the same size, sort of holding the size of the country constant, are smaller. And when they're smaller, there's also a strong correlation with how centralized were they. The more centralized ethnic groups were bigger. And so there's an almost mechanical relationship, and so you can sort of horse race these two in like cross-country regressions, but you don't really know. We don't have extremely good evidence about which one actually matters more. And so all I can do here is I can say, here's one example where I can hold constant one set of those issues, the fractionalization part, and I can show you that just shoehorning people of different historical, having not cooperated traditions together is bad. What I cannot do is come up with a measure that we can then apply to African data. That would be sort of the, yeah, that'd be what you're ultimately after, I guess, at some level. But I got to pass the bucket on for that. Yeah.
Other questions? Jessica and then David.
I'm just curious about crime. There's been a lot of anecdotal attention lately to very high rates of crime, particularly violent crime on reservations, and the fact that their government systems seem totally unable to change anything. Is that something you consider as an outcome? What's an idea there?
It's really bad data. It's the FBI has. Oh, it's about. Do you see more crime? I was actually mostly interested in suicide, because what I really wanted to see is, are people actually less happy in these places? Crime, I mean, crime is certainly a proxy of that to some extent, but I was actually really gunning for suicide rates. And so there's something called the Indian Health Services, but after sort of dangling the data carrot in front of me for 2 years, I just gave up. You just can't, because they're just a small organization, they're just not very good at passing data on to researchers. And so I couldn't get health data. And the crime data, there's FBI crime data at the county level, but the problem is that the average, I hope I remember these numbers right, the average reservation that doesn't fall entirely into a county overlaps with 3.5 counties. And the average county that overlaps with one reservation, with at least one, actually overlaps with 2.5 reservations because of this clustering. So it's just, and because a lot of the variation is actually across reservations that are pretty close to each other, it's just, you just get nowhere near a clean mapping from county data to reservations. Yeah. There is a paper that tries to do that, but I rejected it.
We'll take David.
So two-part question. So first, you go to a reservation, does everyone know their band? And is there kind of intermarriage among bands? Is it patrimonial, matrilineal, or what?
Yeah.
So
Is that you got it? Okay, yeah. I wasn't sure if you would expect me to answer. Okay, so I should answer. Yeah, so that's a really good question. So at some point I tried to run a survey, but then I got scared because the problem is it's such a small policy world, and So one thing that you realize when you talk to Native American policymakers, so people in the field who are actually Native American, they warn you, don't just go and send a survey, because if people get pissed off at you, you're never going to get to send a survey to them again. And so I sort of backtracked and shelved that idea for now. But when you talk to people who are on reservations a lot, there's this sense that no, people don't really have this idea. So there's instances where yes, that is the case. So for example, the most famous Pine Ridge Reservation, where they had that Wounded Knee standoff in 1975, you read about that, yeah, it's like the Bad Faces band was angry at the so-and-so band, and it's like, it's totally there. But in a lot of other instances, you don't read about it at all. And it's just these factions, and it sounds almost more like an extended family. And so one way that I've sort of rationalized that to myself, and I'm speculating, is that it's these band divisions just sort of morphing into these wider family divisions that are, so people don't really think of themselves as being of the same band, but they think of themselves more like as cousins or remote cousins.
Okay, that's sort of short-circuiting the second part, which is going to be to see if you, and so you don't know the band's identity as the tribal leader.
No, I do not.
Kind of index of how frequently that alternates.
No, yeah. So I really do not. Yeah. Even actually knowing the name of the tribal leader, you would have to pretty much call up all the individual reservations. And so there's just, you know, data is pretty scarce.
But it's different when you're saying the African context, where kind of everyone knows that the president of Kenya is Kikuyu or Luo, that you're sort of, this is kind of buried deeper in the...
I suspect it is. So I simply don't have the answer, but my speculative story is that you read a lot more of these type of mafia-esque extended family things and divisions along those lines than you read about explicit bands. I've come across the explicit band thing too, but I've come more across these types of like extended family type connections. Yeah.
I wasn't sure how to read the variable of casino versus non-casino in your data.
Yeah.
What do you find? Is there any pattern?
No, so interestingly, so casinos matter a great deal. So one thing you can see in the panel data is there's this casino effect that just kicks in 2000. And that makes sense because the data is collected decadally. The 1990 census is collected in 1989 pretty much. And casinos really only start right after 1989. So the key piece of legislation facilitating casinos is in 1989. And so you get this definite bang from casinos. All I have for casinos, and by now people have somewhat better measures, but it's not public information yet. But there is a research paper out there that has better than just a dummy, but all I have is a dummy for do you have a casino? It turns out that the casino dummy is entirely unrelated to this forced coexistence dummy. One speculative reason for that is that there's just a lot of social cost associated with casinos, and the other is that the profits from casinos are extremely right skewed. And they actually fall primarily to some of the East Coast reservations that are not in my data because I'm slicing the data to not include any reservation that was formed after 1934. Because when you think about reservations that were formed after 1934, this is when you actually had to lobby Congress to make you a reservation. So now you're no longer in the world of like exogenously shoehorning people into a reservation. Now you're in the world of a bunch of people get together, decide that it's economically profitable to form a reservation, and they lobby the government to become a reservation. And so casino revenues, anecdotally, are actually very, very right skewed, and they're not in this data, essentially.
One hears a lot about alcoholism.
Same answer as the suicide one, yeah.
Jessica's question
Yeah.
about crimes. Does that vary significantly across reservation or band?
You certainly...
So what's it correlated with?
Yeah, so you get the qualitative impression that it does, and I was after suicide rates and alcoholism actually, but you just can't get the data.
There are no.
There's something called the Indian Health
Case
Services.
studies, like anthropologists.
Yeah, I guess I would call that qualitative evidence. Yeah, so certainly there is a lot of alcoholism. There's a lot of childhood obesity. There's a lot of these things that we think have something to do with, I don't know, emotional eating and drinking, I don't know. There's a lot of that, but we don't have consistent data on it.
Well, it would be interesting to try to separate, say, genetic disposition, which I think could be a factor, from things which may be subject to public policy, such as things which change the availability of alcohol, the early treatment of body
Yeah.
alcoholism and so forth.
So my impression from having read a book called 1492, there's also 1491, and I read both. And in one of the two books, they talk about how, because Native American populations went through an incredibly tight genetic bottleneck at some point when they settled the Americas, there's actually very, very little genetic variation across Native American reservations. So pretty much any cross-tribe or cross-reservation empirical exercise is going to hold genetics constant, would be the argument. Yeah.
All right, why don't Anand has his hand raised, but I'll let Anand coordinate with Christian.
I'm around.
So let's take maybe a very short 5-minute break, and then we can reconvene relatively quickly for James Penske's talk at 4:45 sharp.